Okay, good evening to everybody and welcome to the Future of Work Scotland. I am Babs and I'll be hosting this evening along with my co-hosts Sath and Donald. If it's your first time to one of our sessions, we do have a code of conduct which really just covers being respectful to each other so that we all have a great time. There will be a panel section today and a chance to ask questions at the end, so if you can keep yourself on mute, pop any questions you have into the chat, and if you can prefix it with a Q, it makes it nice and easy for us to spot amongst all the chatter. We are delighted to have Dr Suzanne Doyle-Morris join us this evening, talking about lessons from her latest book, The Con Job, Getting Ahead for Competence in a World Obsessed with Confidence. I first became aware of Dr Doyle-Morris's work just after lockdown, when we started to notice that when we were joining a lot of online meetups, people with really great questions were admitting afterwards that they didn't feel confident in speaking up around other bigger voices in the room, even in the virtual world. So following some conversations about the complexities of confidence, I was introduced to Suzanne and to her work. And as somebody who has suffered with self-doubt and confidence issues in the workplace, I personally found her work, especially The Con Job, as a really good guide about how I want to build my skills and project my confidence. So I'm really excited that we're here today. We're going to be focusing on how to redefine confidence. I'm really excited. Oh, sorry, I thought I was getting, I thought somebody had interrupted me, sorry. I'm really excited because we're going to be here today focusing on how to redefine confidence so it works for a wider range of us, and how you can get noticed for your skills, your expertise, and your competence. Over to you, Suzanne.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen here. And yep, that sounds like a good way to start, and then view, because I'm just going to start with a wee little story about how I got into this. Okay, so a few years ago, I was conducting focus groups at a law firm, and they hired me because they weren't getting very many senior women or many women at all up into partnership level. And when I asked them what they thought the problem was, the mostly male partnership said, you know what, there's probably a couple things going on, but I think one thing is a lack of confidence. A lot of women just don't have as much confidence. And what's interesting is they had no complaints about the quality of the women's work. In fact, most of them said it was pretty fantastic. But they were curious about this confidence issue. And I said, okay, I'll look into it. So I did. I conducted focus groups with both men and women and dug a little deeper. And in those groups, I said, how confident are you that you're going to get to partnership? And I got a range of answers. And when I talked to guys, they mostly said, yeah, I could see myself making a great go of it here. I've got a great mentor. I feel, like this is a good home for me. When I talked to the women, they were less optimistic. They'd say, you know what, very few people work flexibly. Almost nobody comes back after they've had a second child. I will be made partner somewhere, but maybe not here. And what was interesting is that as I was listening to those stories, the women in an all-female group started laughing and talking about a specific email they'd all gotten, the whole firm had gotten 18 months prior. There had been a merger between two firms and a new leadership team came out of that. And when they sent round this email to kind of welcome everybody to the new leadership team and the new firm, as it had been newly called, they got an email, and the email looked a lot like this. And when I was listening to this story, all the women remembered getting this email. Let's remember, it was 18 months prior, and they all remembered, they were like, oh God, I remember getting that. And what was so interesting was when I also asked the guys, do you remember an email about what happened when the merger, none of them remembered getting it. But as I'm listening to the story, I'm starting to realize that this is just part of the myriad messages that we all get sent in the workplace and beyond about who gets ahead and who doesn't. And I want to be really clear. Nobody in that group said to me, I'm not going to get ahead because I'm a woman or because of sexism. However, these issues had a way of filtering down to give you a sense of your likelihood of success. And it really made a difference. So that example, that story focused on gender. And I've got to be honest, that's kind of my bag, or historically have really been my bag. I've worked in helping women get the jobs that they want and deserve for the last 25 years. You can see I've written books on the topic. And what's really interesting to me is that when I started writing this book, I also went in with that lens. But when I started interviewing people, I realized how much more complex the issue of confidence actually is. It is much more about context that I'm going to talk to you about tonight. And it affects everybody who is part of the groups I'm going to call the non-status quo from here on out. And I'm going to explain in a few minutes, but it went far deeper than I'd ever anticipated. And we're going to talk more about that. So tonight, what I really like to do is I'd like for us to think about how the way we currently value, and I think overvalue, confidence is a complete con job. No two ways about it, as far as I'm concerned. And this is really important because it affects everybody, probably people like you and certainly me who are on this call who want to get to the next level. Plus, more importantly, I'm going to show you how we can all look at how we should redefine confidence so that it works for a wider range of people. And before we go any further, I've got to be honest, you're listening to me now for a good 3-4 minutes. I'm going to name the elephant in the room. As an American who has lived in the UK for over 20 years, very happily, and in my wee bit of Scotland myself, I know the complete irony of an American telling you that you need to lower the value you put on confidence. I mean, God almighty, unbridled confidence is probably one of America's most recognizable, but ultimately least valuable exports, but we like to send it everywhere. And just because I can't see you today, like my normal face-to-face audiences, I want this to be interactive. So I'm going to ask you to work that chat box. Share your thoughts, reactions, your questions, as Babs mentioned, in that chat box, and they are going to take a list of all the things that keep coming up so we can bring that up, not just to myself, but to the fantastic panel we have later tonight who are going to dive deeper on what this topic means to them. All right, so it's time to get a bit nerdy, not hugely nerdy, but I want to talk about adaptive realism. So that is essentially the phrase that describes that if you see people like you getting ahead, you start to raise your own expectations of what you too might be able to accomplish. However, if you look above you and you don't see anybody with whom you identify, well, you start to lower your own sights a little bit. And all of this can be really subconscious, but it gives you a sense of, okay, where in this pecking order am I likely to fit and how likely can I go? And it affects everyone. All of us, all the time, are subconsciously taking in cues as to who gets ahead and who doesn't. And the problem I find with these lowered sights is that they often get misinterpreted as a lack of confidence. And while we all get that confidence on its own does not lead to success, well, it is kind of seen like a Zen-like umbrella under which all the good stuff in life sits. I mean, we like to ignore that there is a difference between confidence in yourself and confidence in the system. And that was something I was hearing in that first story. You know, it is easier. That's a problem because it is far easier to blame the individual for what they're lacking than for us to actually address what is going on in this society, this organization, or even in my management style that may not be fostering confidence equally amongst everyone. So essentially, I think this is really important because, frankly, you know what? Competence sounds dead boring, but it gets the job done. It makes sure that risks are reduced, and it's that safe pair of hands. Yeah, really unsexy term, probably the unsexiest I've ever learned since I came to Britain. But it's something we all should really want. I mean, after all, if you had a desperately sick child, who would you want to operate on them? A confident doctor who's, he's sure he's got this, or someone who reads all the journals, who does all the research, who is exceptionally skilled and competent. It wins every time. Because remember, competence is how good you actually are at something, whereas confidence is how good you think you are. And that's a big distinction, because praying at the false god of confidence, well, it risks promoting the wrong behaviors and ultimately making the wrong decisions, which I worry about hugely. And the people I interviewed often were concerned about as well, but could be fooled by as well. So we're going to see that this is not even correlated like people think. They think these two things are the same, but they couldn't be further from the truth. And assuming it is that what's going to get you ahead is a distraction. It's the greatest con job ever, because the irony is that, if I'm honest, I never thought I would be someone who would write a book that is downplaying the value of confidence. It is why most of my coaching clients are referred to me, is they're told that this is what I do. But the greatest secret of my life, and I know maybe some of you on this call have even worked with me, is that I never actually work specifically on confidence with my clients. They go on to get promotions and make more money and all that great stuff. But what we're doing in all of our sessions is working on their competence in managing their stakeholders, their goals, and the relationships they have with everybody else around them. Because if you can get those skills, those competencies right, well, you're going to be a whole heck of a lot closer to confidence, but almost as a byproduct, not as in itself. I am definitely not the person to just come to, if you want to fake it till you make it. And I really think that none of us should, frankly. So I am probably not the only one on this call who has at times said, you know what, I would love some more confidence. And I hear that a lot, but realistically, what I started recognizing when people said that to me was what they really meant was, I want more opportunities. I want more recognition for my work and ideas. And I want to be heard. Who doesn't want that, right? I mean, most of us want those things, not just confidence. We assume it's this panacea. But what I discovered is that confidence depends a lot on who is looking at it and who is doing the judging of your confidence. Now, in the organizations that I advise, which tend to be in male-dominated fields like technology, finance, those groups, what I see is that, the closer you are to any of these bullseye center qualities, the closer you are to our definitions of what confidence is and looks like. And I recognize, as someone who sits mostly in the bullseye myself, that talking about privilege is actually hugely uncomfortable. And I want to be really clear, I'm not saying that things are perfect if you're in the bullseye, but let's be honest, you are statistically much closer to our ideals of what confidence is and who deserves to show it. And that's problematic for this modern workforce we've got. And the research is really clear about this. A big worry that I've got is most people don't know that these two categories, confidence and competence, are actually inversely related. So the boffins of you on the call, and I know there are many, will know that this means the one goes up, the other one goes down. And I think what's really interesting is that it means that the more confident someone becomes, the less time they put into doing their job well. Because remember, they've got this. And by contrast, people who are really skilled start to understand their competence can actually diminish at times and falter simply because they recognize how much bigger the topic that they've become an expert in, how much more complex it is, how many more questions there are to ask, how much they don't know. I think we see this a little bit actually with the way many doctors talk about COVID. They're never got a quick answer for any of us, because the knowledge is always emerging. And so they don't come across as the most confident and bravado type people on TV. But what's really interesting is it's because they recognize the complexities of all of these issues. So I think what's really interesting is that faking it is not comfortable for most people. And I think the people that you actually need to worry about in the workplace are those who find blagging it or shooting from the hip actually easy. Those, for me, are the people to avoid, because they're less likely to put in the hard work to getting better at whatever skills you want them to get better at. So earlier we started talking a bit about the status quo, which is a way of talking about power and privilege. Who has it and who is less likely to? And when I started interviewing people for this book, I was, as I said before, humbled by how much more complex, how much more multi-layered and nuanced this whole topic was, according to some of these categories. And the way we think about confidence, or more specifically about how it's displayed, but also more importantly, interpreted and received by other people, well, it varies depending on where you are in these categories, because it's often, confidence, a byproduct of privilege and building a career when you're surrounded by people who are a lot like you. I am not defining people by the challenges they have, and I'm not undermining the wins that successful people have had. But what I am doing is asking for us to look at this in context, so that we can find out more equitable definitions that would work for a far wider range of us. And when I interviewed people like, I'm lucky enough to have a panelist tonight who I interviewed for the book, Silka Patel. I interviewed nearly 40 leaders, and they came from about 12 different countries, and they had different versions of what confidence was. But what was interesting is they had some similarities, and they were actually similarities that I found pretty concerning. So when I asked people what confidence looked like, they would often come up with this list of phrases for the way they would describe it. You might look at this list as well and say, yeah, that looks about right. And I would totally agree. It does look about right. That's, all of that seems fairly straightforward. However, when non-status quo people use these same behaviors, we label them very differently. What I've discovered, or what I found out, was essentially when we see confident behaviors in people who are from Latinx backgrounds, we describe them as being spicy or fiery. When Black people show confident behaviors, we describe them as being uppity or angry or aggressive. And when people from, be honest, when I came to the UK, when I came to the UK, the issue of socioeconomic difference was the first time I'd really been mindful of it. And that's when I started learning phrases like someone needs to know their place, or is acting above their station. And that's before we even get through all the list of phrases that we use for women who dare to have an opinion on a topic. Those women are confident, but they're also bitchy and brazen and bullshit. I know I've been called all those things. And in the chat box, it'd be interesting if you've ever been called any of these things as well. So for me, let's just take one of those definitions, or one of these descriptions, and look at it on its own. So it's probably my least favorite one. It's feisty. All right, so feisty. Feisty is the dog that you may have literally just seen making his way out of this room. He is feisty when he sees the white cat who happens to meander sometimes into our garden, and will just drive him crazy. But what's interesting is feisty is really about small animals that have no real power. But think about who you hear called feisty on a regular basis. I'll ask you a question. Would we ever call this guy feisty? Probably not. I've never seen someone like him being called feisty. No, people would say he fights his corner, and that's a good description. But in a weird way, he's doing the same thing that Angus Khan, but also people from non-status quo backgrounds are doing every single day in fighting their corner, but we're more likely to label them as being feisty or uppity or difficult. And the reason this is important is because we totally penalize people, penalize them big time when they demonstrate confidence, but in ways that we're not accustomed or even comfortable seeing in them. So, you know, traditional definitions of confidence and the way we expect to see it displayed, they just don't work, as you can see from some of these headlines, for far too many of us. And I gotta ask, because is self-promotion or blagging it actually a valuable skill? Those are clearly things that we describe as confident people do, but I'd say most of us work in teams. So are those types of skills really useful? Probably not. They don't serve anyone, but they do hold back people who could contribute more, but for whom a sense of bravado or winging it or faking it just don't resonate. Because essentially we wrongly assume that confidence and competence, as we've seen, are the same thing when they are completely not. And it's helpful. This is the thing, it is helpful for the status quo that we think of those two things as the same thing, because it becomes then the greatest tool that the status quo use in order to remain in power. It becomes a distraction. Because focusing on someone's lack of confidence as the main thing that's holding them back, well, then that becomes their problem. And I don't have to do a damn thing to help them because it's her issue. So if I'm that leader who says, you know what, I would love to promote Maya when she's got a bit of confidence, then that's great. It just puts the blame on Maya. It means I don't have to look at what I could do to help her. It moves the responsibility completely back to her. And the worst thing is the Mayas of the world, the Suzannes of the world, the Babs of this, the Sath, they believe it. They believe that that's what's holding them back. It means that we don't look at the bigger inequities in life. And that is really problematic. So you can see what a distraction and how convenient it is for the status quo. Because as far as I'm concerned, it is a complete paradox to write off certain groups of people for their lack of confidence and judge them at the same time when they do show it. Instead, we tell them it's their lack of confidence and they buy it and they just quietly go away hoping that they'll get more confidence in time. So we do this so much. We link confidence and power so much to masculinity that another word for confidence is one you've probably said yourself. I know I've said it, cocky. Or that if I did something really risky, well, that took balls. So those are like, we totally think that they're the same things. Similarly, if I show no confidence, if I'm a bit weak, well, then I'm liable to be described as being a pussy. So look at how we gender language and power and confidence, and who has rights to it. And I gotta be honest, that last description it just implies an inferiority I just do not get. I mean, let's be really honest. When we talk about strength and balls, you are actually really vulnerable with a pair of balls. They are weak, they shrink in the cold, and they are just, they're sensitive. But if by comparison, you want to look at a part of the anatomy which is very resilient, well then look no further than the female anatomy when you think about what is involved in childbirth. So I think the way we talk about these issues really then informs the way we think about power and confidence. And I want to be really clear, I am not male bashing in the least, because I actually think outdated versions of what confidence is actually serve none of us. We often assume that men have loads of confidence, and something that I'm assuming some of you on the call will be able to correctly tell me is a falsehood. What's really interesting is that stereotype of men having loads of confidence and nothing to see here, things are all good. That, I think, contributes to the fact The fact that some of you on this call will know that suicide is actually the #1 killer of men in this country under 45. So we desperately need different versions of what confidence is that will work for everyone. So I want to spend the last few minutes looking at how we can redefine confidence and the ways, what we each need to do to get there. Because based on that, for me, that's about the stories that I heard, stories from people like Silka and many others from around the world. And when I think about the descriptions they gave, they often focused on these 3 factors. Now, these are not the ways I've historically seen confidence, but I think the stories I'm going to tell you highlight why I think we should be thinking of them as the new confidence, if you will. So let's start with humility and self-awareness. And so I interviewed a woman, Kainaz Gazder. Now she is based in Singapore. And she told me after a year in her job, her first job, she was called in by a boss. He was really difficult. He would walk the floor, asking them all questions, shouting if you didn't have an immediate answer to really technical questions. Real fun guy all around. But what's interesting is he asked her in, and he asked her after about a year, he said, "So how are you getting on?" And in that moment, she was so stressed. She said, "You are the reason I can't stand coming to work every day." And in that moment, they both looked completely shocked that she had said that. She couldn't believe she said it. He couldn't believe he'd heard it. But to his credit, he asked her some more questions. He asked her for feedback, what he could be doing better, and he listened. And they had a good conversation about it. And she said he never was exactly the perfect boss, but what was fantastic is he did make changes not just with me, but with the whole team. And superficially, we hear this story, and it sounds like it's about Kainaz's confidence in speaking truth to power. But actually, I also think it's about her boss's confidence in listening to tough feedback and making choices that would make him improve, which is what he did. It takes a lot of confidence to ask for that and be able to do something with it. So I'm probably not the only one on this call who has had feedback that was hard to hear at the time. But if you make changes as a result of it, then you're already ahead of the game. But realistically, that is a type of confidence, to seek feedback and be willing to make changes. So every one of us, just like Kainaz did, has an impact on the people around us. Her boss did on everyone else, but she did in that moment on him as well. And we have impacts in ways that, sometimes you can't even imagine, but that completely makes sense, because actually, if we think about it, everyone on this call is hired, fired, or promoted based not on how good we think we are, but on what other people think of us. So feedback is really important. And it really is just about listening, asking, listening, and then acting accordingly. And if you're anything like me, it was hard to hear at the time, but you're desperately grateful that you got it so that you could make changes. So the second way is by acting on their courage of their convictions. And that's also not something we always refer to as part of confidence. So we assume everybody who is confident wants to be at the top, and anything else is a lack of ambition. But Sandy Kennedy, who is here in Scotland, he's a CEO of Entrepreneurial Scotland. He followed the courage of his convictions early on in his career. He was starting a law career, and there were good things that they were saying about him, that he would go far. But one day he was working late, and he happened to see a list of all the partners at that firm, and just started going down it, and he's like, oh, this one is having an affair with somebody on the other team. This one is going through his second divorce, and this one never sees his kids. He said, in that moment, I realized that I didn't identify with any of them. They weren't the me I wanted to become. And so I knew that while I had the law degree, I couldn't stay. So he left and he developed another career around entrepreneurialism. But what's so interesting is that his leaving was not about his confidence, but about his values. Yet we see people from non-status quo backgrounds leave work all the time. And when they do, we often describe it as they didn't have the confidence for it. Because if we were to look at it as a clash of values, or not feeding who they are and their soul, realistically, that would mean we have to ask some bigger, tough questions about what it takes to succeed and what you're selling when you give up in order to get to the top. And it makes us wonder, is the view from the top really worth having if I have to sell so much of myself in as part of that? Because if it's part of disengagement from your core values, then is it worth having? But those questions, asking those and making decisions is part of your courage of your convictions. And for me, that's really important because that won't always look as grand as what Sandy did necessarily, but it may be about starting to ask to work more from home. I mean, Lord knows we're all working from home, but maybe spending more time with ailing parents, or taking a greater share than maybe your boss thought of your paternity leave. Or maybe it's taking time to do volunteer work that would feed your soul as well. That's all about following the courage of your convictions. And I think that is a type of confidence that we do not praise enough. So for me, the last story I'll tell you is about a woman named Sasha Mooney. Now, Sasha Mooney is a Black British barrister. And she went against the grain in a courtroom many years ago when she stood up to a judge in the middle of a chaos of where there was some Ugandan defendants, and she was one of the barristers in the room. And they weren't her clients, but the judge turns to her and he sees a melee of people, and he just turns to her and says, "Sasha Mooney, can you do the translation for us?" And she said they weren't even her clients. So she ignored him for a while and tried to pray that he would realize his mistake. But as the only Black person other than defendants in that room, she eventually had to say, because he kept asking, "Sorry, in Bristol, where I was raised, there was no need for that Ugandan dialect. So I could try to give a Scottish accent a bit of a go if that would help you out." And then he apologized immediately. But what's so interesting to me is that Sasha has to go against the grain every day just to show up at work. And she said, the reason I'm not flying my flag for the Supreme Court is actually because there's just not many people who represent minorities like me. And that's a big deal to me. So going against the grain looks like that for her. And we will also then say she doesn't have enough confidence, which completely makes no sense to me. But it also is something the status quo guys I know have to go to. Because if you are the first on your team to take more time off with paternity leave, for example, or family leave, or to call out another person who makes a really off color comment or joke, and you challenge him on it, or if you're, as we were talking about earlier, if you're somebody who actually opens up about mental health issues, those are ways that you go against the grain, go against our expectations, but they too are descriptions of what confidence looks like. So no matter where you are, just to wrap up, in this bullseye, it is time to recognize the con job for what it truly is. We have to widen our definitions of what confidence is and all the many ways it takes shape and is demonstrated, because that's the only way we're going to ensure we get a wide range of leadership styles, which more people can identify with. Because in the end, it comes back to us acknowledging how much you can't be what you can't see actually does affect confidence, and how it changes depending on who is judging it. Now, I wrote this book pre-COVID, pre-George Floyd's murder, before we knew that we would now be starting to rebuild our economy. But what is clear is that we are in an ideal time for redefining so much about the way we work, the values we have, and what we want to, who we want to be going forward. If this is not the right time to redefine confidence so that it works for more of us, then I ask you, when is? Thank you. So on that note, I'm going to bring in the fantastic panelists that we've got, because frankly, that's how I see this topic. I'm sure everybody on the chat box and also our panelists will see it again in different ways. So we've got Silka and Manira and Pritam here tonight with us, which is fantastic. Babs, do you want to say anything about how we've been able to pull these group together, or?
Yeah, so these were mutual acquaintances of the leadership team and yourself as well, and we were looking for people who were quite interested in this topic, who might have some views that they'd want to share with everybody and kind of get this conversation started. And I have to say that it's going to be a really, really interesting panel. We've got some really great people in it. I'm really looking forward to this bit.
Yeah, definitely. And what's exciting for me about this panel is that we've got a range of, you know, people from education, health, you know, government, but also not government, but in terms of private and public organizations. And I think this is going to be a really interesting conversation. So let's get started. I mean, I want to hear from each of you, but why do you think that this is a topic that we need to be talking about more now? Silka, do you want to kick us off?
I can kick us off, yes. I think it's important that we're talking about it now, and you touched on the fact that we have George Floyd's tragic death and the rise of Black Lives Matter as a campaign and as a voice. And recently in the workplace particularly, I've seen that people have come to start to challenge that and start to voice their opinion with the backing of the fact that this is something situational that's happening now. But they've waited, and they've waited for something pivotal to happen in order to feel that they have the opportunity to have a voice. And for me, it shouldn't be that. We shouldn't have to wait for a crisis or a pandemic or something really huge to happen on a scale to empower employees to be able to bring their true self to work, or to have an opinion and a voice of something that does go against the status quo. So for me, now is definitely the time for change, and we shouldn't be waiting for anything. It should happen if it needs to. And something that sort of resonated with me, particularly being of a woman of color as well, is that when research always shows that there's underrepresentation, particularly of female ethnic minorities in digital occupations. And then I look at the pipeline coming out of education, and I know that 5 years ago, Strathclyde University had done some exit interviews on females dropping from STEM-related courses. And the single main reason that was cited in those exit interviews was the lack of role models. They just didn't see people that looked like them coming out at the other end. So it's not always about who shouts the loudest to me, but it's about leading with competence, not always confidence.
Fantastic. All right, so there's no favoritism here. I'm literally just going down the list. All right, so Manira, can you take us away too? And that's, Pritam's gonna be like, oh, good, I got another minute.
or between me and Silka will do all the best bits, fingers crossed. So thank you, Suzanne. It's always a pleasure, and I always learn something new listening to you. I guess for me, it is clear that we as workers or employers, that we've been inherently entrenched and indeed indoctrinated with the notion that those that speak the loudest know the most. And actually, it is the inverse that's true. So confidence was what a 1960s, 1970s trait that we haven't had the ability to shake off in the workplace. And theoretically, it is believed that confidence helps the organisation to excel. It's good for the shared value. It strengthens and positions you in the marketplace. It makes money. And that belief, and following on from what Silka was saying as well, that belief is still there within organisations. So thus we have CEOs and shareholders that end up paying big salaries and giving top jobs for those that bring confidence rather than competence to the table. But dare I say it, you know, not stating the obvious again, it's, you know, we're in a pandemic. You know, the last 4 or 5 months, the whole world has been fighting against a killer that's unseen. It's affected all generations and has affected everyone, nobody in different manners and means. And my last 4 or 5 months living and breathing COVID, literally 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, in my day job, it's been an eye-opener. And what I've started to realise and understand and see around me is actually the bit about humility, Suzanne, you talked about. It's the relational leadership that's coming to the forefront. So actually understanding the relationships that are needed to connect individuals together. In COVID, there was nobody with confidence. So if I can speak quite openly and candidly between us all from a public sector, nobody knew more than each other. It was all an unknown. So confidence could not play the top player in this game. It had to be competence. It had to be people with knowledge and skills and experience from their past lives that came in. And that gave rise in the last 4 or 5 months to relational leaders, leaders that understand that humility is a superpower, that understand diversity by true means. Diversity is what's going to make us overcome this. And I'll give you a real live example in between the pandemic, and this hopefully, Suzanne, will ring music in your ears. But in the pandemic, my organisation came into force. So I work, as you can see in the background, no secrets here, with Public Health Scotland. And in Public Health Scotland, 75% of the senior leadership team are women. Fabulous, fabulous. However, is it diverse in other traits? Sadly not. Not yet. We're still a young organisation. We've still got a lot to learn. But the leaders that have been appointed, they bring themselves into the workplace and they let others grow and be their own. And I guess for me, that shows the true leadership, the true understanding of what competence means in a world where before confidence was put on a pedestal.
Manira, thank you so much for bringing that COVID point back, because funny sideline is that I pulled the book from publication so that I could write a prologue, because this was due to go out in late March. And I was like, oh my God, the world is falling apart. And this is just how we got here, which is we had overconfident leaders saying, this is nothing to worry about. We've got this. And then what I thought I saw, and what we're all living through, is all competent people, our key workers, everyone who is cleaning up the mess of those early decisions, are people who, by definition, we don't praise for being confident and, you know, with a lot of bravado. We praise because they're competent. So again, it's this situation of the competent cleaning up the messes of the confident. So thank you for talking about that. And I know your experience with the GP cluster. I love that phrase. I don't even know what that means, but I gotta say, it sounds like the most delicious breakfast cereal I've ever had, healthiest cereal I've ever had. Was, you know, it's amazing to me. I thought, ooh, that sounds good. He's in charge of the the informatics of all GP clusters. I was like, that sounds delicious and healthy as well. So thank you, Manira, for that. Pritam, what's occurring to you?
Gosh, well, so much really. Where to start? First of all, the competence, confidence thing. As an academic, there's an underlying assumption to pretty much everything that we do, and that is that if you build the competence, the confidence will follow. And unfortunately, that's not the case, as you very very well demonstrated. That just isn't the case. On another side, I like to take it away from the kind of institutional self-preservation, keeping the status quo going and how difficult it is to break through for everybody, to more kind of practical, kind of my domain, which is the project management domain. And in the project management domain, it's characterized by huge amounts of uncertainty. And one of the things about uncertainty in those kind of environments, when people project confidence, they're immediately, I wouldn't say promoted, but they're certainly immediately hired. And there have been plenty of, I mean, you use the phrase of the economic cost of overconfidence. And I would say that, you know, in project management, there's a huge economic cost of overconfidence. And that is reflected in things like estimation. There've been a lot of studies where people always underestimate the time, the cost, the usual project parameters with regards to delivery schedules, with regards to pretty much everything to do with the project. So then you're looking at that, we value these people who are over in the project management domain, who project confidence. Why? Because we operate in an environment of huge amounts of uncertainty. So in the uncertain environment, we, you know, the overconfidence is almost, you know, incorrectly king. And then what that leads on to is the knock-on effects of very, very poor estimation. And it also goes back to a lot of the, I mean, there's so many aspects that you covered, things like, you know, unconscious bias, things like, I mean, immediately when I was thinking about project, I was thinking of Daniel Kahneman and thinking fast, thinking slow. And thinking fast can be a sign of overconfidence, but usually, as Kahneman shows, thinking fast isn't necessarily going to get you the right answer. So I'd say that there are certainly, in the project management domain, in my domain, there are so many knock-on impacts of overconfidence, and you summed it up really well, the economic cost of overconfidence.
It's interesting you mentioned Daniel Kahneman's work, because there was a quote that I had in the book, which is actually from him. It's from an interview that he did many years ago when he was talking about biases, which is his, you know, his raison d'etre, if you will. And he said, confidence is probably the worst of all the biases. So when you said that, I thought, there's someone who I would completely identify with that on you as well. So, you know, those are all really important examples. You know, I want to know, because one of the things that I found with the people I interviewed, and certainly the people I've been lucky enough to know in my own career, is that when they start to unpick what has given them confidence, it's not this fake it till you make it, or tell yourself you love yourself in the mirror, or anything like that. It's getting better at a specific skill. So I wonder, did you guys have a skill set that you learned? Or, I mean, I know that I certainly have had, where I just had to get better at something, and the better I get at it, the more confident I become. But it means I'm still learning all the time, because I know I can never stop learning. How about you? Does that resonate with you guys?
So for me, we were discussing it in the chat earlier. Sath mentioned, you know, the fake it till you make it, which is something that's thrown about a lot, especially in the workplace. I personally cringe when I hear that, because I often find that it's coming from female leaders, surprisingly, saying that. And maybe because they've felt that they've had to make it. And to an extent, maybe it has worked for them and it has paid off. But should we be comfortable with what we call, you know, imposter syndrome? And it's something that you talk about in your book, Susanna, I think in one of the chapters, chapter 5 or 6, something like that off the top of my head. I have read it.
This isn't a quiz. This is not a quiz.
You're testing me.
Sorry, what was the page number there?
So definitely it comes up all the time, but actually I find it more of a trust quality when someone comes across more vulnerable and they're being more authentic, and that vulnerability for me will instill trust in that person, which is far more greater than me assuming or thinking that you may be able to do it because you're faking it. And so I actually think that I personally put more in that vulnerable quality, which may not come across as confidence, but it's truthful.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that makes a lot of sense. You told a great story about an interview you had. Can you share it with the audience? Because I think it's a funny story, but I thought, you know, you shared your own vulnerability, but so did he.
So I was tapped on the shoulder to apply for a board position with an organisation, Technology Scotland, and the MD, the CEO at the time, phoned me up and said, can we meet for a coffee and have a chat? And as you know, most work comes about through word of mouth when it comes to things like board work. I did my homework on this board to find out who sat on the board and how long they'd been serving for, and I knew of the work that they did. And to no surprise, the board was male pale stale, which is the phrase that's thrown about, and that's not to take away any qualities of competence for the board, because they are very competent and credible board members. But there was no diversity at all of any kind. I'm not talking gender, I'm talking ethnic, I'm talking age, race.
Nothing visible, nothing visible.
Nothing visible that I could see. So I went along for this chat, and we were getting on really well. The conversation was flowing, and he opened up and told me about some of the challenges that they were having in the board, and where they needed some steering and some guidance and support, and where he saw me playing in that role. And I was sitting on my hands the whole time, you know, like almost like a naughty school child, you know, waiting and waiting. But there was something burning me. And because of the way that he came across, really authentic, very vulnerable himself, and honest, I asked him the question of, am I a tick box exercise? Because I fit so many bills for you to look to me. And he said, I'm not going to lie to you. You are. But at the same time, I see the competence in you to be able to deliver. And it was a moment where we shared that. Both of us, our guards were down. We were both not faking it. We were both being very vulnerable. But from that born a great relationship, and I still sit on Technology Scotland board and kick ass.
I love it. I hope that's what it says on your business card, right?
I kick ass. I should get that done.
Kick ass. Manira, what about you? When has growing your skills actually given you confidence by default?
So I guess for me, just listening to Silka there, just talk that out loud, kind of reminded me, and if you can divulge me in sharing a quick story as well, when I was quite early on in my career, and at this point I was in the private sector, as many people in the public sector call it, the dark side, which I continually need to defend to this, you know, since I've been in the public sector. But anyway, best years of my life in the private sector. And I was like a young whippersnapper, straight out of university, had a lot to learn. I knew I had a lot to learn, but also was really grateful for the opportunity. And I remember being introduced to, at that point, would be one of the senior managers and their manager, and through looking and hearing and speaking them talk, like Silka and in what you've described as well, there was knowledge and experience coming through, but there was just something that, you know, that to this day I still remember, is as it felt you moved up this organisation, you became more of a generalist rather than a specialist. And we know as leaders, you can't know everything. You cannot know everything. You need to know a little bit about a lot. And actually, for me, I still had the confidence in the most senior person at that point in the room, though they did not know the detail. They had, and I've said this a few times even in the chat, they had that humility and being able to bring people and knowing whose expertise was needed into the room. And I guess that was a really enlightening moment for me, because the next 7-8 years was spent building my skills and knowledge, so in turn building my competence. And through competence, by default, my confidence grew. So I don't think I can say, I can't rock that I kick ass yet, Silka, but I can be crazy sometimes. And I guess for me, I still feel I'm still within the public sector now, seeing that I need to back up my confidence with the competence, where I've seen others have not had to do that. Some of it because they maybe have a bit of longevity in the organisation than I do. So I guess it doesn't really answer the question, but I think my example there shows that truly for me, faking it would have never have worked, Suzanne, never have worked faking. I'm not very good at it. But what I have learned is actually it's okay as I now am moving up into senior positions. It's okay not to know everything, and not to kick yourself in the back all the time thinking you need to know the detail. And being able to be confident to say, I don't know the detail, but I have the right people around me that know that detail and have the humility to bring them into those conversations and not think you always have to be the top person leading all these conversations at senior level.
No, that's a great point, Manira, about, because I think you're right that as we all know, as you become more senior, you can't do all the detail, and that's not what this is about. What this is about is thinking, okay, how do I generate others to have confidence in me, because I also know who to go to, where to find out, who on my team knows these things, where else I can make connections. Those are hugely valuable and will create people having confidence in you. And what's interesting is that if you look back, and I'm going to get really nerdy on you here, to the 15th century Latin definition of confidence, that's the first time it ever shows up in the dictionary, is confidence was something you only ever had in people. It meant trust. It was not something you could ever display yourself. I have confidence in Manira for figuring out these things. I have confidence in the church at that time, or whatever it was. It was never, I'm confident myself. It was never that until the mid 1800s, when we started seeing more press talking about con jobs, people who were able to convince others to give them things. They were like, oh, well, they inspired confidence in the victim to hand over their money. And this is where we get the genesis of the con man and the confidence job, or the confidence trick. But it was never about something you just displayed as, I want confidence. The irony, of course, now is that when people say, I want more confidence, no one's really saying, I want to be more trustworthy. And frankly, if they are, then I think those are the people you need to worry about. Because if you were saying, I want to appear more trustworthy, I think, hold on to your purse. That's a concern for me. So Pritam, what about you on this topic around, a skill set that you built that gave you confidence?
I think I kind of come from a teaching academic background. We have a particular approach to things, which is much more of a curator's approach to things. You're not expected as an academic to know everything. And then and to be honest, usually you're not that challenged in terms of, well, certainly on many occasions you are, but there's no expectation that you need to know absolutely everything. And that, as the advert goes, you know how to get it, or you know a man that does know about it. And that kind of changed drastically when I started doing commercial training. And commercial training was very much, you were the domain expert. And I quickly learned that the academic approach doesn't work, where you kind of know the main themes of things, but you know a lot of things. So you have a lot of knowledge of a lot of things, but each individual thing, academically, you tend to say to students, well, look, let's go and have a look at this in more depth later or at another point in time. I don't know how many of the people in the audience are commercial trainers, but commercial training, you're on the spot, and if you don't know the answer, you're no good. And there's this whole thing about, well, you have to build the confidence. So basically that pretty quickly early on shattered my confidence. And it wasn't until I really got to grips with the material and really understood it. And in fact, you know, to be honest, I'm still learning about it. I'm still learning about the material because there are so many different interpretations, but there is no substitute for competence. And to be honest, Suzanne, I'm wondering if is that the kind of, I kind of see technical skill sets as a kernel, as the nut in the middle of confidence. And I think I see other layers around it of other elements of confidence that have this kernel of knowledge and skill sets that build the confidence. So there's other elements to confidence as well, obviously things like interpersonal skills, communication skills, etc. So I was just wondering, Suzanne, about what you think about that in terms of confidence. Does it come from simply, is it too simplistic to talk about technical skill sets delivering competence? Or is that what you're talking about, competence, or how
so for me,
enlarging it?
Yeah, so for me, the kernel that you're using on which you build everything else, that technical skill set, is obviously a hugely valuable place to start. But actually, what I also think really true competence is recognizing that you'll probably have to look at that kernel on an ongoing basis to see, is this still accurate? Does this still hold true? Because actually, people who know their realize how much new research comes out, how much technology changes, all of these things, which will affect that kernel as well. So as long as you're not holding by the kernel and saying this is the truth forever end, but you're willing to explore that kernel as you learn more, then I don't have a problem with the kernel as long as it's a kernel you can unpick a bit. That is a weird amorphism of an onion and a kernel, and a very bad, what am I thinking, bad way that I've just described it. Very unhelpful analogy when I'm mixing my onions and my kernels, and I wouldn't even be delicious. It's not even nearly as delicious as a GP cluster, which I'm gonna try to go to Tesco and see if they've got that cereal. Anyway, Babs, I know we've probably got some questions or points from people. Do you wanna take us along? Because I can't even mix my metaphors anymore. So I'm hoping you can do a better job than me, lady.
Okay, sorry, I might have a little bit of background noise here, so if there's anything coming in, just I'll try and ignore it.
Don't worry, a feisty dog, better than a feisty dog.
So we had one from Victor earlier saying, mental health issues are particularly difficult to navigate. It may be that you could be behaving in a way that's not seen as fitting within the social convention. I have unfortunately witnessed a pretty nasty case of bullying resulting in an unfair dismissal. I feel that going against the grain may be actually quite risky to some degree. Any advice on mental health challenges in the workplace, specifically to do with the topic of confidence and competence?
Gosh, that's, Victor, a really great point. For me, I didn't look hugely at mental health needs in the book. What was interesting is when I started this book, I thought it would be where I've always written about gender. That's my background. That's what I did my PhD on. But as I started to unpick that kernel, I knew I could bring that back, that onion, that kernel. As I started to unpick it, I realized how much bigger it is. But one area I did not look at was mental health issues. But you're probably right. There is probably much more that could be written about how that gets interpreted. And if that's a type of competence we value, of sharing that, and even some of what you just said makes me think even raising that is a confidence issue as well. I don't know.
I've seen recently a rise of mental health being a topic in the workplace being discussed, and whether they be employee resource groups or something that is either a top-down initiative or organically growing, but mental health seems to be much more acceptable to talk about in the workplace, and people are wanting to learn and people are wanting to find out more, and there's a whole load of resources out there that help managers and leadership teams to be able to feel safe in exposing their, you know, their lack of knowledge in those areas. It's not always down to your HR and your people and culture teams to give you the answers to this. But if you witness anything, or you have concerns of an employee or colleague or anything, should you just sit on it, or should you do something about it? And you may not have the answers, but again, going back to Pritam and Manira's points earlier of surrounding yourself with the answers, surrounding yourself with resources where people can actually help, because there are free resources available that will come in and give you a leadership pack on what to look for, how to address it, how to have the conversations, what happens next. So I think we're too hard on ourselves, expecting us to have the answer all the time, and we don't need to.
Thank you, Silka and Suzanne. If you don't mind, I could maybe come in a bit of Victor's point. Victor, we do have resources, as Silka was alluding to, on NHS Inform about mental health. So it's just the website NHS Inform, and there's a lot of others. I'm happy if you want to pick up offline to kind of let you to share them with you, or I can share them with Babs. But I guess what I wanted to maybe do is, if you would indulge me for 2 minutes, is share a live example without betraying any confidentiality. So right now, this is not rehearsed, Victor, this is because you posed a question, but right now I'm actually overseeing a performance-related case that's actually at the second stage. And again, I won't go into any detail, but what as unearthed at the second stage, at the second formal stage of the process, which is third stage and you go to dismissal, is that there's been underlying mental health problems. Now, how did we get an individual to go through so many development plans, an individual then to go through to first stage informal, then go to formal, then into second stage, and not through all those conversations be able to unearth that there was an underlying issue around mental health? What's happened is this whole process has exacerbated the condition, and there has definitely, even within the public sector, a lack of understanding of how to deal with it, a lack of, I wouldn't say the lack of empathy, because, you know, in general, people in the public sector join the public sector because they're quite passionate, you know, not to make money as such. So there is that lack of empathy there, but just not knowing how to field it. And now we're at a position where actually our own protocols, such as occupational health, aren't giving the individual really support as they need. So it's actually turned from a performance-related issue into something more serious, and that's a big worry for us. That actually how we've let somebody go through that. And as Silka said, you know, mental health is one of something that's even in the public sector talked about quite openly now, talked about at all levels openly, yet people are falling through the gaps. So I'm not saying what we have even in the public sector is perfect, but God damn, we're learning fast, and we want to know that we create safe and secure and environments that people can be themselves when they come in. But it's a team effort. We're no way greater than the sum of our parts. We need to come together and do this. So yeah, I'm happy to share whatever I've got in my journey, especially in this example, to help you on that, Victor. But a great question, great question.
Sorry, I've gone back the wrong way. Sorry. Oh, do you have any more questions for us? Hopefully there's been some good chat.
We do. I'm going to take over from Babs, because unfortunately she seems to have some drilling going on in the background, so an anti-social neighbour. We've got another one here from Joanne, and hi to Joanne, because I know her, we used to work together. So Joanne's question is another great one. So she's asking, if confident people are more likely to step up and take centre stage, how can we proactively identify and champion competent people? That's a brilliant question. Putting you on the spot now, Suzanne, there you go.
Yeah, no. I think that's a great point. So what I do is, for me, I think we need to be questioning those people a little bit more about the detail of what they've done. So one of the things when I talked to some HR leaders, they said is just make sure that you're unpicking as much as you possibly can. So when someone says, oh, I've done this or I've done that, get it down, drill them down to, okay, what part of that did you deliver? What was your role in that team? What was the way you helped on that problem? And getting really specific. specific. One thing that was really interesting in the research, and I'm sure once I tell you the research, people will be like, of course, that makes complete sense. If you want to know someone who is overconfident or even narcissistic, which I end up talking about in the book too, because that I think becomes an offshoot of confidence. It's confidence to the nth degree, if you will, is you want to discover if someone's that way, then challenge them on some of the assumptions they've made, some of the things that they claim that they've done. Nothing annoys somebody who has narcissistic tendencies or overconfident tendencies more than being challenged. I think we see this in workplace, but we also see this in politics, where if you second guess anybody, just say, oh, how did you come to that agree? You know, how did you come to that decision? Even kind of basic questions like that. A very competent person will be able to talk you through the steps and all the variables of what went into that decision or what went into that project, whereas somebody who's blagging it will want to keep things very superficial in their descriptions of what they did and why it was important. Another good tip is if you ask what they regret or who else had to get involved on certain projects. If someone says they have no regrets, be wary, is all I could say. If they can't think of when they've done something wrong or the impact that had on other people, then again, I would be very concerned as to what they're actually, you know, what they're, not just their lack of empathy, it's not a lack of empathy as much as, it's partially that, but it's actually just self-awareness. And one thing that was so interesting to me when I was researching the book was how directly correlated high self-awareness is to good leadership behaviors. That was really interesting to find all the research in the journals, academic journals, around how those two things are directly correlated. Yet self-awareness is not something we talk about or even praise that much in the workplace. But I think it really is a key skill because it makes you better at, even if you're not selling, but it makes you better with your teams and everyone else that you have around you. Because going back to what I said before, you kind of have to know what other people think of you in order to get ahead, because the decisions that people make about our, you know, promotions and firings, they're not because I've said I'm so great. It's because you come and make that decision or not. So self-awareness and how you're regarded by others is really important. It's part of that answer. Does that make sense? What do other people think about that?
So Suzanne, I was going to, just when you were talking, and thank you, and John, what a great question as well. It just made me think something when I first started in the role in the public sector, and I was noticing that it was very hierarchical, you know, so you would work up the ranks, and actually somebody said to me once in the first few months that, where's your stripes? You haven't earned them yet. And I'm thinking, what does that mean? What does that actually mean? I actually had to go away and ask somebody what that actually meant, but they were referring to the fact that I hadn't been in long enough to be able to have a voice around the senior table. So within the first, I think just after my first 6 months of being in the organisation, I ended up starting to bring people that had the skills to lead small programs of work. So as leaders, you know, it's not always about leading from the front, you know, the age-old saying, leading from the back. But I tested this out within a safe enough environment to take the most experienced person. And in some of those cases, it was one of the most junior, but they had the competence to lead a program of work. And as leader to be able to, you know, take away all the barriers that they face so they could have a good sail at it. And I started to do that, and suddenly we would have really junior members of staff presenting to the board. You know, and that isn't the norm. You have a hierarchy. You have a hierarchy for a reason in the public sector, because there's the Q's and I's and the I's and T's that need to be crossed and dotted. And that just changed the perception of how leaders thought or valued competence. And it wasn't because you had earned your stripes. Your competence is valued on your skills and experience. Now, I knew what I'd done was quite risky. I could have ended up not getting my contract renewed, but 4.5 years later, I'm still there. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but so there's something about, it just takes one or two of us to be a bit courageous, to kind of take a bit of that risk and let others kind of step up and grow our future leaders. So it's finding what's the equivalent in the space that you're in, to be able to allow competence to shine over confidence. Thanks, Suzanne.
Yeah. What about Manira? Not Manira. What about Pritam or Silka? Do you guys have any ideas on that as well?
Well, again, coming at from a project management perspective, there are many methods where some of your ideas, things like humility, courage, are actually built in. They're baked in to methods such as Agile, XP, Scrum. Some of these are actually baked in. And if you look at some of the people who have worked, who have taken these new approaches on board, so that stress huge amounts of collaboration, cooperation, who are moving away from hierarchical top-down command and control type structures to much more empowered, self-organizing teams. The whole concept of servant leadership comes in as well. These are all attempts to, I would say, address quite a few of these things in the way that people actually work. Now, they have limited success. Sometimes they're very successful, but then they do better in things like new startups. So you find that startups, small companies, they're really, really good and they do really well. If you come across things like public sector, whether it's the health sector or whether it's local authorities, they have great difficulties, and probably because of entrenched ways of doing things. And the principles that they embody almost contradict some of the kind of existing principles that these organizations are used to working in that way. So a lot of the ideas that Suzanne, you've expressed are absolutely key for people looking to develop these new and different ways of working.
Thank you. I think that's that I'm glad to hear it's more baked in your workplace than others.
I should qualify that and say theoretically it's baked in. The reality is usually totally different.
Okay.
You've actually highlighted a big problem. And the problem is that the implementation is never the same as what the intent is.
Yeah.
And therein lies the problem.
Yeah, okay. Now I think that you have more in common with many of the people I interview who are in different workplaces or different sectors. Just to finish up on that question that you mentioned, Joanne, I think two good questions that you can ask people if you're trying to keep those behaviors in check is to ask somebody, tell us about a decision you made that didn't go well. And that will help somebody. It forces them to go into that humble place. And if they can't come up with one, then that's a concern. I think another one is, tell us about a time when maybe somebody they would consider a subordinate had a better solution to an answer, to a conundrum than they did. And again, giving credit is not something that the confident like to do to other people. And when I say the confident, I mean the traditionally confident. Because remember, we think of self-promotion and confidence often as one and the same, but I don't think they are. The confident will often take credit from other people. So ask somebody, ask them when they saw people had better ideas, and if they can share their credit, then there's somebody to keep and to know. Silka, did we say, is there anything on this one around Joanne's question that you wanted to raise?
I think we've covered a lot of the points of it, and I echo what Pritam and Manira has said, but I've also said in the chat about trying to create the culture that you want to be a part of, particularly if you're a manager or a leader of people. Think about the traditional mid-year check, performance review or the year-end performance review, and should that be a time where people who are less likely to shout out the loudest and display confidence and shows that they've been doing work, maybe use that as something that you could do more regularly to draw out people's confidence and competence, so that you are giving them a stage and a platform, but you need support in order to create that framework. But if it works at smaller divisional levels, even team levels, then that's not to say that it can't have a ripple effect and affect the organization. So you don't always have to wait top down for some kind of process or procedure to be put in place. You could start it, even if you're a team of 3 people. But if you're a leader of people, it does come down to you. You've got to be willing to put yourself out there to say, I'm going to drive change. I want to be able to give the competent people who are less confident in my team an opportunity to show their confidence in a different way.
Mm-hmm. So to paraphrase one of the things you said there, it's going back to that expression a lot of us know, which is be the change you'd like to see.
Yeah.
All right, Sath, anything last? Any last moments?
We do, but we're running dangerously close to the end of our
I know
time.
how this team rolls. I know future
I'd love it. I'd
roll
love it if
on
we
time.
I'd love it if we could keep going, but we would like to wrap it up. But I'll tell you what I'm going to do. We've got 5 minutes. That gives me enough time to close everything off and do the usual community shout out. So very, very quickly, because I think it is so fabulous and it does tie into some of what we've been covering and some of the chat that's going on in the chat window actually between our wonderful attendees. Can confidence be viewed as a skill? There's more to the question, but I'm not going to read it because I think we're going to run out of time. So a great opportunity for you, Suzanne, and our wonderful panelists to give us a very short answer to that question, as succinctly as they can, in the remaining 4 minutes, and give me enough time to close. Go.
Okay, no. So for me, it's just a byproduct.
Okay,
It's just a byproduct. If you're confident about something you're not good at, then get better. Get better at that thing. So it's not a skill on its own.
Great. Silka.
I like the word confident. I'm not scared of it, but it's come with experience. So I put confidence and experience together.
Okay. Pritam?
I think developing an awareness is important. I think, to actually attempt to address some of these issues, it's not going to happen unless there's an awareness of a lot of these issues.
Manira?
So for me, confidence is an emotional intelligence. So for me, know your emotions, and then you can too kick ass like Silka and rock confidence where you need to be. I've never used ask this much in a
just
webinar.
From being on this panel, there you go.
I'm going to say this has just been a kick-ass session with kick-ass guests and a kick-ass panel and a kick-ass audience. There you go. So good. Right, fab. Thank you all. We've got 3 minutes. That gives me just about enough time to bring up everything to a close. It's been absolutely fabulous. We've had so many sessions over the summer. We've been doing these every week since April, and we've never done such a panel discussion. So it feels a real privilege to have had Suzanne on this evening, and also to have had the benefit of a panel also offering their amazing insights. I've absolutely loved it. I think our audience have loved it. It's just been brilliant, and well done to Babs for hosting it, because we've never done one like this. So just I'm unmuted. It'd be wonderful if everybody could quickly unmute if they're happy to do so, and give our wonderful speaker and our panelists a round of applause, because they thoroughly deserve it. Thank you.
Great job. Thank you.
Excellent. Really enjoyed it. Thank you all. Grateful for you joining us and for giving up your time. It's been really, really good. And I am reading Suzanne's book, and it's fab. So there's a plug for free. Not from Suzanne, from me. So it always feels better. Right. I've got a couple of minutes just to do the usual wrap ups. Again, thank you for joining. fab engagement. Really enjoyed the chat in the chat window. Next week, for those of you who are in the Agile space or interested in Kanban, we have the awesome Dan Vacanti, who is one of the world leaders on Kanban, joining us for what should be an amazing session where he'll be talking about the age-old problem of when will it be done and what does it take to come up with estimates and how do you do that reliably and all the challenges of doing that. I think it'll be a brilliant session. So if that's of interest to you, do please join us for that. And closing out the month, we have Simon Brown joining us from Switzerland, who will be talking about the themes in his latest book, The Curious Advantage, and he'll be joined by his co-authors. So, yep, another fab session. So that's it for this evening. Thanks again to our speaker and panelists. Absolutely loved it. Thank you all for joining us. Really, really enjoyed having you here, and thanks for your engagement. Again, well done to Babs for hosting this evening, and we hope we'll see you again in future sessions. Enjoy the rest of your morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you happen to be. Thanks again. See you again soon, folks. Thank you.
Bye.
Cheers.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Cheers, Seth. Take it easy, buddy. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.